Wednesday started as a normal weekday. As usual, Juliana planned to go to the editorial office to meet her editor and hand over the finished material. This routine was not only a habit for her, but also a kind of ritual that helped her keep her life in order. This time, however, her plans did not come to fruition. When Juliana opened her phone, she noticed that she had received a message from an unknown number. She couldn't even guess what was in store for her. At first, her gaze stopped on the picture attached to the message. The picture was of her husband, whom she seemed to know like the back of her hand. This time, however, he looked alien and unfamiliar. His arm was gently encircling the waist of an unfamiliar young woman. There was no mistaking the gesture. It was too intimate, too eloquent. Juliana froze, her thoughts darting from one thing to another. Who was this man who had dared to tell her such a bitter truth? What were his motives? Could it have been just an evil joke? The questions overwhelmed her, but there was no answer. Suddenly, the phone vibrated in her hands again, and the same number that had sent the unfortunate message popped up on the screen. Her heart beat faster, mixed with fear and curiosity. With a slightly trembling hand, she pressed the answer button. "Hello," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, though her insides were churning. "Hello, Juliana," came an unfamiliar male voice. He sounded steady and confident, but it was immediately clear to her that she was hearing him for the first time. "Don't be frightened. You don't know me, and neither do I know you. It was a miracle I got your number. Did you look at the photo?" "Yes," she said, trying to suppress her growing anxiety. "Who are you?" "The still, lawful husband of the one whose face you just saw next to your spouse," the voice explained with quiet bitterness. "I'd like to punish the cheaters a little, and then I'd like to divorce my wife. If we're on our way, I'd be willing to take you on as part of my revenge plan." Juliana was stunned. She never expected this turn of events. Her world had been intact an hour ago, but now it was beginning to crumble, revealing cracks she hadn't even realized existed. "Are you sure there was an affair?" she asked, still hoping for a rebuttal, that it was just a misunderstanding. "Yes," he confirmed confidently. "I hired a detective a couple of weeks ago, and I can show you more intimate moments of your husband's life. But I didn't dare to shock you like that. You never know." Julianne felt panic overwhelm her. She needed confirmation, a chance to look into the eyes of someone who claimed such terrible things. Her decision matured instantly. "Let's meet. I want to be sure of what you're saying," she said, feeling the words barely out of her lips as they became momentous. Soon they agreed to meet in the nearest park, where everything would be clearer. The meeting of the two conspirators took place in the cool shade of the park, where the trees seemed to whisper their secrets to each other. Juliana was the first to arrive and looked around nervously, expecting to see the man who had offered her something more than a conversation about betrayal over the phone. Soon, she noticed a man striding confidently towards her. It was Constantine. Tall, stately, with a piercing look in his brown eyes, Constantine seemed at first glance to be the embodiment of the very heroes she had once written about in her novels. A wave of surprise swept over Juliana. Her husband, compared to this man, seemed a pitiful semblance of a man. She barely restrained a surprised sigh. "Hello again, I'm Constantine." He introduced himself, and his voice sounded soft, but with a note of iron confidence. Juliana, trying to hide her excitement, barely audibly replied, "Hello." Constantin, as if catching her confusion, pointed to the nearest bench. "Let's sit down," he suggested, as if anticipating the upcoming conversation. When they sat down, Constantine took some photographs out of his pocket and handed them to Juliana. She scrutinized them carefully, and with each new picture her heart clenched more and more tightly. In these pictures, her husband, the very man with whom she had shared her bed and household chores, looked like a stranger who had betrayed all their vows. These pictures shattered the last doubts all at once. There was no more fidelity, no more doubts. What do you suggest? Juliana asked, not taking her eyes off the pictures, trying to hold back the storm of emotions that was raging within her. Constantine looked at her with a slight chuckle, understanding her feelings but not giving in to her emotions. Of course, I could suggest that you take revenge in their same spirit, he began, and his voice grew colder for a moment. But, to be honest, I'm a loyal man by nature, and I can't go without love. Though that love has evaporated now. But come on. Here's what I've come up with. He spoke calmly, as if describing a simple plan for the weekend. The idea he proposed was ironically simple, but sophisticated in its conception. To put laxatives in the food of unfaithful spouses before their next date. The idea was so out of the ordinary that Juliana smiled involuntarily. What makes you think they'll eat before they go to the hotel? She asked incredulously, though she had already begun to imagine the scene of revenge. Constantine answered confidently, like a man who has studied the habits of his enemies. I have already learned their tactics. They always meet after work, so they are hungry. Juliana found the idea both maddening and appealing. The mere thought of how the traitors would be tormented at the worst possible moment made her feel unusually satisfied. Yes, such a revenge would be really original and leave no obvious traces. And how do you put laxatives in them? She asked, already fully involved in the proposed plot. Constantine grinned, satisfied with her interest. That's the easy part, he said. I found out that my wife is cheating on me from her friend, and he works in a cafe where they usually go. His wife doesn't know him, but he saw her in a photo when I was showing off my good looks, so to speak. Their conspiracy was taking shape more and more clearly. The plan was almost perfect, to break off the relationship with pain and humiliation, but without open conflict. They agreed that as soon as Constantine learned of the infidels' new rendezvous, he would immediately inform Juliana. But they did not have to wait long. Already, the next day, all the conditions for their little revenge came together. With excitement and a slight tremor on her lips, Juliana steered the car toward the cafe where her husband and his mistress had decided to eat before their next date. This place, seemingly unremarkable, had suddenly become the scene of their small but meaningful game. Having approached the agreed place, she got out of the car and moved into Constantine's automobile. They were like two accomplices in a revenge movie, but the reality was much harsher. They sat in the car, hidden from view, and watched time slowly tick by as the scene of betrayal unfolded inside the cafe. After 40 minutes, which seemed like an eternity to Juliana, the door of the establishment opened. Out stepped her husband and his companion. The couple, immersed in their shameless intimacy, were unaware of the stares that followed their every move. Juliana clenched her fists but remained speechless, watching the traitors head toward the hotel as if oblivious to the world outside their ambiguous reality. When the hotel door swallowed them up, Juliana and Constantine exchanged a brief glance and without a word got out of the car. The decisive step, the barely perceptible tension in Constantine's posture, and the slight trembling in Juliana's hands, everything said that they were ready for the next step. At the reception, they were met by a young employee, whose face lit up with a mysterious smile as soon as she saw Constantine. "Hello, I called you today," he said quietly, trying to hide his excitement. "And is it about your wife?" the girl asked with an understanding intonation, and winked playfully, as if this meeting was a part of some conspiracy she knew. Constantine, with a subtle nod, handed her the passport, which contained a large bill, a hint as clear as the morning dawn. Juliana watched this exchange, realizing that the cameras placed all over the hotel could record any carelessness, but Constantine was extremely careful. "Here, the 14th room. It's in that passage, and to the right." The girl returned the passport and the key, without giving away her emotions. Constantine, who had obviously agreed in advance that their room would be next to his wife's and her lover's, nodded in gratitude. Juliana, as if in a fog, followed him. They came to the door of the 15th room, freezing for a moment before it as if it were the final barrier. From behind the door came muffled voices that sounded notes of alarm. Juliana listened and realised that her husband and his mistress were discussing a sudden digestive problem. The words were spoken with irritation or nervous laughter, but the general mood of the conversation clearly indicated that the evening had not gone according to plan for them. The laxative had begun its effect. Constantine, keeping his hand on the doorknob, turned it gently. The door yielded without a sound, revealing to them a scene worthy of a theatrical production. In the semi-darkness of the room, they saw their halves in a state of utter confusion. The couple, only partially clothed, froze on the bed before they realised what had happened. Constantine said, loudly and with a barely perceptible chuckle, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife through a dense cloth. There was a silent scene, full of tense silence. At that moment, when time seemed to stop, Juliana and Constantine stood in the doorway, watching the world of their unfaithful spouses crumble before their eyes. The scene that unfolded before Juliana's eyes seemed frozen in time. The couple on the bed, sure of their secrecy a moment ago, suddenly found themselves naked not only physically, but mentally as well. Tension hung in the air. It was almost palpable. "Oh, Mummy!" cried the mistress. Her face turned white and her eyes widened with horror. Like a frightened animal, she jumped out of bed and, stumbling, rushed towards the bathroom, where she disappeared, slamming the door behind her with a desperation that bordered on panic. Juliana, keeping outwardly calm, only looked coldly at her husband, who had suddenly lost all confidence and dignity. He didn't seem to fully understand how and why things had gone wrong. "Darling, you've got it all wrong," he murmured, a note of panic in his voice. He held out his hands to her as if he hoped to bring back the trusting and loving Juliana, but her face remained impassive, like a mask. "I understand," Juliana interrupted him sharply, not allowing him to continue his excuses. Her voice was as hard as steel. "I've already seen the photos of your previous meetings. You'd better keep quiet." Those words sounded like a sentence. Any attempts by her husband to salvage the situation were futile. He shrank under her gaze, losing the last vestiges of pride. Juliana realised that all of her past associated with this man was now a ghost that she no longer wanted to see around her. The end of it all was that Juliana coldly and emotionlessly announced the divorce. This word, which fell on her husband like a block of ice, left no doubt. There was no way back. Constantine, watching this scene with a kind of satisfaction, remained in the shadows, but his presence was felt at every step. When the cheater, trembling with fear and embarrassment, returned from the toilet, he came forward. His voice was firm like a sentence. "At home, you are no longer waiting. Tomorrow I'll take your things to your parents." These words, like a hammer blow, left her no hope or choice. She nodded, unable to look him in the eye, and quickly left the room, leaving a trail of perfume and humiliation in the air. When Juliana and Constantine left the hotel, leaving the ruins of their relationship behind them, Juliana suddenly felt a strange feeling. Not anger or joy, but something unexpected, almost pity. She turned to her new acquaintance and said, "You know, I even felt sorry for them." Constantine looked at her with a slight smile, his eyes read understanding and perhaps even a slight sympathy. "Nothing, but they will become cleaner. Maybe they'll wake up," he said, as if to reassure her. 2 days passed. 2 long days, filled with reflection and reassessment of the past day. Juliana let her husband take her things in her absence, not wanting to see him again. In the silence of her home, she often thought of Constantine, his confidence, his cold calmness, and the strange spark that had passed between them at the moment of their first meeting. She did not regret the way things had turned out. On the contrary, in this chaos she felt something new, a strange sense of freedom. Suddenly, one quiet evening, her phone rang. A familiar name popped up on the screen. "Hello, Juliana." Good afternoon. Constantine's voice sounded. His intonation was calm, almost friendly. I was wondering if we should go to a cafe. Juliana felt her lips curve into a smile, and she replied cheerfully, only on one condition. What? That your friend doesn't work there. She laughed, and her laughter sounded light, as if the weight of a heavy past had dissolved into thin air. Juliana, hearing Constantine's voice in the phone, felt a slight excitement. The proposal to meet, which sounded so unexpected and at the same time so natural, seemed to close the circle of events of the last few days. But the joke that burst from her was both light and symbolic. The laughter, so sincere and carefree, diffused this tense atmosphere that had hung over them since their first meeting. I agree, Constantine laughed in response, his voice finding a warmth that contrasted so strikingly with the coolness he had shown during their previous meetings. This time, we'll choose a place without surprises. They agreed on a time and place, and as they hung up the phone, Juliana stood still for a moment, looking back at the changes that had taken place in her life over the past few days. Not long ago, her existence had been filled with routine and the illusion of stability, which, as it turned out, was only a thin shell hiding the cracks that had long been spreading through their marriage. Meeting Constantine in a small, cosy cafe, where quiet music and dimmed light created an atmosphere of comfort, Juliana felt the tension of the last few days gradually fading away, giving way to a new feeling: relief. She looked at Constantin, who was sitting opposite her, and saw before her not only the man who had become her companion in the moment of despair, but also the man with whom she could start something new. You know, Juliana began, looking carefully into Constantine's eyes. Everything that happened, it was like waking up from a long sleep. At first, it was scary, but then I realized that was probably what I needed to see reality as it was. Constantin nodded, his gaze remaining focused and deep. Sometimes you have to go through pain to truly begin to live. And while it may sound like a cliché, it's moments like these that open our eyes to what's really important, he said, sipping his coffee and continuing to look at Juliana with understanding. They talked for a long time, discussing not only past events, but also their lives up to that point. Juliana told about her dreams, once buried under the weight of domestic worries and routine. Constantin shared his thoughts about how infidelity had destroyed his faith in love, but at the same time, in a strange way, gave him the freedom to start anew. That evening, they both realized that behind the storm that had swept through their lives, there could be a calm and clear dawn. As they parted at the entrance to the cafe, they felt that their shared story might just be beginning. Several weeks passed, and Juliana, completely freed from the shadows of the past, more and more often found comfort in communicating with Constantin. They met, walked in parks, visited exhibitions, discussed books and movies, as if they were two old friends who had finally found each other after years of searching. One day, when the autumn sun softly illuminated their faces, and a light breeze played with fallen leaves, Constantine suddenly stopped and, looking at Juliana, quietly said, I thought I had lost faith in real feelings. But you gave it back to me. Juliana, feeling her heart beating faster, couldn't hold back a smile. I, too, thought that after all this I could never believe in people again. But I think you've helped me find myself. And at that moment, standing on the fallen leaves under the shade of the trees, they both realized that this meeting, their acquaintance, and everything that had happened was no accident. Life, like a craftsman, had first put them on the edge of a precipice, but then gave them a hand, helping them to overcome it together. A few more months passed. Juliana finally turned the page of her past life, filed a divorce, moved into a new apartment, and plunged headlong into work, finding in it not only distraction, but also inspiration. Constantine, despite all the difficulties he had experienced, also started a new life, free from lies and deceit. But most importantly, they continued to move forward together, sharing not only joys but also sorrows, building a new future in which there was no more room for betrayal and pain. On one of the warm summer evenings, when the sun was slowly sinking behind the horizon, colouring the sky in soft pink tones, Constantine took Juliana's hand and, looking into her eyes, quietly said, "I don't know where this road will lead us, but I am sure of one thing. With you, I am ready to go through it to the end." Juliana, squeezing his hand, felt a calm and confidence spill over into her soul. She knew that there would be many trials ahead of them, but she was no longer afraid. There was a man who not only understood her pain, but helped turn it into strength. Although life was unpredictable, they both knew that now they would go forward together, like two ships that had found their way in a vast ocean.